Parking problem.
Or in your 23.
Yeah, that's where we're gonna 28 on truck when you're ready.
Go ahead.
One truck, white Lincoln X-ray 985 should come back up next.
So you had 2000. Patrick Spalding.
10-4. If you can just put a note in something like that, I'm gonna be leaving a note on a vehicle if I can remove it.
Rockingham 505. And shipping Dillison case for Athens, complainant, soon to be ex, slasher tires, and has made threatening comments to her. She's concerned he might return.
Yeah, forgive this at 32.
10-4. You're assigned to a vandalism case in Athens. Did you copy the 505?
Yeah, 4. Look at that.
21.
No, 3 in Depot Street. Truck boy entry 5.
7435.
10-4.
10-4.
You go 43 again.
143.
You go with that 43 you had. I didn't hear any, but I had just looks like we do.
10-4. I just wanted to know if you should be put back 76 to Cabana Circle or to the subject's address.
Yeah, I'll be 23 back on that found property case, and I'll be 76 to the Williams Road address to see if I can find the owner.
10-4. 449 1120.
449 1121, thank you.
10-4.
Code 4. 4.
Currently at 535.
Yeah, that was a great college.
535.
Should be. You guys know for a woman who fucked into a house. I'll slide up that way.
Caller is now been able to close the front door. He's now pounding on the door, trying to get it still. Fight for longer here. Cyanide shirt on. And number 21 is
We have separation. Inboard now. She's ready. Hey guys, good to see you here as always. Happy Friday night. Hopefully, you're going out and doing something much more fun than watching this channel. But if you're here, we'll try to make it a good time if we can. We're going to do a show tonight until 9 on this. Then I'm going to end this show and I'm going to restart at 9:05 after I go and grab a beer for members only. This is just a way to try to give back to the people that signed up for the membership. I think it's $2.99 a month. But if you're not a member and you're regular here, my email is leitskev, LEITSKEV, at gmail.com. And so don't fret. If you can't figure out how to sign up for it, email me. And as long as I recognize you and I know you're a regular, I will give you the stream link. And then you can actually come backstage and just watch it from backstage. So don't worry. Nobody that is a regular here that will have to miss anything. And also, while we're doing that member show, if anybody wants to come on and join us, this is a really good chance to do it because it's members only. Now, that doesn't mean that somebody, you can't guarantee total privacy that someone doesn't sneak in and take some clips or something like that. But they'd have to pay a couple bucks to do it. It's a little bit less likely. So if anybody wants to join us, that this is a really good time to do it. And you can come in without your camera or with your camera, however you like it, as long as we can hear you. So, all right. Thanks, guys. Good to see you. Thanks for being here. So we had some motions this week in the Karen Reed case. No surprises. The motions were approved by the prosecution to get the full transcripts and interviews of Gretchen Voss. I think also her notes as well. And also to get the full interview that the Reeds did with Fox 25. So we know also they did more interviews with ABC News, I think, for 2020 and Nightline and things like that. There's no new rulings on that, and I'm not sure where that stands. I think actually those were approved actually last for the first trial, so I'm not sure if new rulings are required on that. They were approved. That's because there's a second issue there, and this may come up with the Fox 25 one too. If it's out of state, there's some more hoops and whistles. RL, it's LEITSKEV at gmail.com. And so so I'd be happy to send you the link before 9 o'clock. If you email me, if I see the email from you, I'll send you the link and you'll be able to watch from backstage. In terms of commenting, you can once you're backstage, but you'll have to figure out how. And I won't probably have time to explain it to you, but you'll certainly be able to see how we're all partying backstage, we're all drinking and doing lines and stuff like that, like rock bands from the 80s. No, I'm kidding. It's just this is the internet world. It's not, you're just gonna be sitting there. All right. Yeah, Thomas put it up there. Okay. So no surprises on the rulings coming up on the 12th. So that's, let's see, today's the 6th. So that's 6 days from now. So next Thursday, I guess. I think next Thursday will be the Dauber hearing on Dr. Russell. Now, lawyers, these are clever lawyers that have done very big cases. They presumably know what they're doing. So it's interesting for us to watch from the outside and just wonder, what's the strategy? What's going on? I read the motion. I'm not even going to bother sharing it with you guys because it wasn't that interesting, but the motion for this Dauber hearing from the prosecution that's explaining why her testimony should not be allowed. And I didn't see a single part of that was any different than what the state tried in May. It was exactly the same as what Adam Lally tried. And it didn't work then. It's not going to work now. It's the same judge. And there's always going to be, with any judge, a lot of latitude that the judge gives to a defense to bring in their experts. And she may not be the best expert in the world, but she is qualified. She was an ER doctor and did peer-reviewed public research on dog bites. They were police dogs, so it's a little bit different because they're taught different techniques, such as bite and hold and things like that. But still, it's the same breed. Generally, it's a German Shepherd. So I think she's pretty qualified. You can make this time, Rena. It'd be like 9:05 because I have to just stop to go get a beer and then reboot. So we're going to try to end this one at 9 and start that one at 9:05. I hope you can make it, Rena. if you looks like, oh, you do have the membership. Green means membership, right? I think. All right, we're still figuring this out here at Yellow Cottage Tales. We're a little slow on the technology side. So I don't know what the prosecution is really hoping to accomplish here with this attempt to get Dr. Russell excluded. And this doesn't seem to be any new arguments or evidence in that motion that the prosecution filed this week. But again, these people play on a different level, and we don't know what the game within the game is. Is it a chance to maybe? I don't know. It becomes too speculative. Like, are you trying to make Dr. Russell look bad in a hearing in front of the crowd that influences the public perception? Because that could backfire. Dr. Russell, a little bit of an older woman, but like most people, she's going to do better the second time than she did the first time. She's now, like anybody, you get practice at doing something, you're going to do better at it, So hold on one second. It's going to take. This time of year, the stink bugs come into the house. All right. So I'm not sure what the purpose is of this thing. Are they going to present new evidence? Are they going to, they're going to bring up things like, why didn't Dr. Russell consider the fact that no canine DNA was found on the clothing? But I think Dr. Russell would rightly say, well, that's not the kind of, I'm not someone that's qualified to do DNA analysis. I have no idea the veracity of that testing. All I'm brought in is to look at these wounds and give you my opinion, my expert opinion on what they are. And she's going to be allowed to do that, barring something really unforeseen here. That's my opinion. I'm not a lawyer. But I did say the same thing about the phone records of Mr. and Mrs. Reed. I said that on this channel right after that hearing. I said, I don't see the judge allowing that because it's a fishing expedition similar to going after, for instance, the phone records of Kevin Albert, who wasn't at the party, or going after the phone records of Brian Albert, who was John never went in the house. I mean, so things like that. This judge and most judges are not going to allow. The law is clear that you can't go on fishing expeditions. So there's no evidence or even any indication that Mr. or Mrs. Reed committed any crimes or participated in any kind of a cover-up here. So I think there's going to be a strong presumption that they have a right to privacy. And that turned out to be the case. But that's not to say that the prosecutor didn't anticipate that. My guess is that he did. And he has some other reason, game within a game, as I talked about on the last episode, for doing that. Try to dial up a little bit more pressure on Mr. Reed, who's expected to actually testify this time. That could be a reason. It could be knowing that this judge likes to split decisions. Maybe that was a way of making it a little bit less likely that she would approve the defense motion on Morrissey's communications. Now, we still don't exactly have a ruling on that either, because from what we found in the last hearing, Special Prosecutor Brennan is kind of cooperating with the defense on that, and nothing is expected to turn up there. And let's be honest, it's very unlikely anything was going to turn up on Mr. and Mrs. Reed's phone. They have Karen's phone, and it's very unlikely that something's going to turn up on Morrissey's phone. There's no indication of any wrongdoing by District Attorney Morrissey. I know that's not going to be popular with the Horde. They like to turn this guy into a Batman villain, but there's just no indication of anything like that. He seems kind of like a by the book kind of guy, not very exciting, but kind of a by the book kind of guy, not really a politician. He runs unopposed in his district, in his county all the time. And he gets like 96, 97% of the votes because this is a Democrat state where there's generally no opposition. So unless you're going to primary him, he doesn't really have to campaign. So no, maybe that's that's never a good thing. But you don't usually see district attorneys out there maybe being too active on the campaign trail, like say somebody running for Congress. All right, what I thought it might be interesting to do tonight was go into where it all began. All right. So let me bring this up. This is the motion filed on April 12th, 2023. Let's see if I can get this. All right, nice. This is, I never know with the format. Sometimes it lets me make it bigger. So this is, oops, that's a little too big. Something I've never heard before. All right. So I will get to your questions, but we'll do a lot of the questions, especially for people doing the members only show. But I want to go over this document. It's just, so just so you guys, veterans here, understand. But if I'm going over a document, I'm not going to see questions too well in chat or at all, depending. So because I have to read from the screen. But before we even begin reading this, let's go over the history here a little bit. So when did the third party culprit begin? And I came up with a theory on this as I was writing the book. And then I reached out to Canton sources and they proved it correct. And my theory was that, well, let's go back. So we know that, so John died on January 29th. That was a Saturday. On Tuesday, February 2nd, I believe, Karen was arrested and she was arraigned the next day on Wednesday. So according to Yannetti's version of the story, Stephen Scanlon, a private investigator who knows Brian Albert, who is from the area, had left a message on Yannetti's office phone Wednesday morning. He left it under an alias. And he said, I have information on the case or something to that effect. Yannetti didn't call Scanlon back until he was on his way home from the arraignment. And in that call, Scanlon told Yannetti that he believed, or some version of this, that that John was killed inside the house, that he was attacked by Brian Albert, his the nephew, is the way it was put, and a federal agent, which obviously turned out to be ATF agent Brian Higgins. So in some sense, you could look at that and say that's the beginning. All right. Now, just an hour before in court, David Yannetti did not say my client is factually innocent. What he said was my client had no criminal intent. Now, we see it all the time in cases. You know, you got a guy who's committed multiple murders and he's caught dead to rights and goes into court for the arraignment, and his lawyer says, my client is innocent, and we look forward to our day in court. That's like a standard thing, right? Because they can always change the plea to guilty later or whatever. But you start out with the idea, my client is innocent. That's not what Yannetti started out here. He went into court and said, my client had no criminal intent. So they had no concept at the time of that arraignment that Karen might not have done this. They had no idea of that. He met with Karen for the first time that day. He had been talking to her on the phone since Saturday, but he met her the first time in court. I'm sorry, at the jail cell, and they met over the prison bars. And Yannetti brought it. Now he had the charging document in hand, and he read through it with Karen. And then Karen was brought away to court to be arraigned. So what we know is at that time, Karen did not say to David Yannetti, I didn't do this. She didn't say anything like that. She didn't give him any reason to believe that she didn't do it. They were at that time focused on saying that it was an accident. That's what they were focused on. And that's why he said, my client had no criminal intent. He said it to the judge, and then he said it on the courthouse steps a few minutes later. So when Karen was at the time that Karen was arrested, which was Tuesday, she had no concept of even trying to say that she didn't do it. Nobody had planted that idea in her head. Now, Scanlon reached out to her, though, over Facebook before she was arrested. So presumably on Tuesday, it could have even been as early as Monday. But let's just say probably Tuesday. But he couldn't have said, I have evidence that John was killed in the house, because if he did, Karen would have said, oh, really? And then she would have told that to David Yannetti later on. Hey, I didn't do this. So even though we don't have Scanlon's messages at the time, he probably just said something to the effect, hey, if you need a private investigator, I might have some interesting information on this case or whatever. And she replied, contact my lawyer. So it didn't, whatever it was, it didn't seem to really intrigue her at that time. So he didn't say much, if anything. But then by Wednesday evening, when he's on the phone with Yannetti, he's now got this theory that John has been killed inside the house. Now, this is David Yannetti's version of it. Scanlon would later be interviewed by the troopers a year ago, a little more than a year ago, this past fall, fall over a year ago. And he claimed that he never heard that this involved Brian Albert until he showed up at the Yannetti's office. He was, after the phone call, he was invited to the office, and he claimed that it was only there that he learned from David Yannetti and from their private investigator, Paul Mikowski, that it involved Brian Albert. Now, I personally don't believe this. Scanlon has an incentive to not tell the truth on this. And the reason is because, look, he's kind of an old friend of Brian Albert. It's not a close friend, but a friend a little bit, a colleague, someone who's drank with him, who's been to his house. So for him to reach forward to David Yannetti based on nothing more than rumors is not a good look. So it kind of looks like he's stabbing his friend in the back based on rumors, and which is actually what it was. It seems to have been that. So that's why he's probably not telling the truth on that. I do believe Yannetti is telling the truth, that's what that Scanlon first told him that in the phone call. Okay. But so the question is, where did Scanlon pick this up? And my theory was that the elements of this case were just kind of perfect for an urban legend myth to evolve in the days right after John's death on the ground that would give rise to this idea that John was killed in the house. So you have a cop who was found dead or dying on the lawn of another cop. He looks beat up. Now, right there, with that alone, you already have the conditions that are right for a story to start, for people to start saying, hey, there's something fishy about this, right? And so people are and there was an after hours party at the house. There was a lot of drinking. John was dropped off for the after hours party. So it's very easy for things to just organically form as people were talking then over the next couple of days, with the idea that John went up into the house and got beat up, and they just carried him out and left him on the lawn. It didn't really require any single person to invent that. And I don't think you'll ever be able to find any single person that did invent that. There are different people involved that had been friends with Karen and John, such as Tom Beatty. And Tom Beatty had a flirtatious relationship with Karen before John's dead. These are people that frequently all got together at the Hillside Tavern. And, we know Karen flirted with Higgins. And we're told that she flirted with Tom Beatty. And after John's death, Tom Beatty flirted a little bit with her, but they stayed in touch. And in fact, according to the version of events that Karen tells in Gretchen Voss's article, Tom Beatty was the one that told Karen that the Alberts owned a German Shepherd. So you see the theory starting to come together so it starts out. Sorry, I just got up my phone charger wasn't working. This charger is buggy. So it starts out organically. I don't know why this charger won't work. It starts out organically, and then for some reason, it starts out organically. Scanlon jumps in. He's trying to take advantage of it. He wants to when will this charger work? Sorry, I just want to make sure the phone is hooked up in case people try to connect to me, or I get messages during the show. All right, there we go. You never know. Maybe someone will message to say that they did the chip off today and there are results on it. I don't expect that to be the case, but we know that it was scheduled, I think, for today, at least the way it had been explained in court by Prosecutor Brennan a few weeks back. So anyways, Scanlon is a guy. He's worked law enforcement adjacent all his life, but had never quite become a cop. So he worked for Suffolk County Sheriff's Department, and then he works for Worcester County Sheriff's Department. And in 2014, he's working as a internal affairs supervisor, I believe, at the Worcester County Sheriff's Department. So he's worked his way up to a good position, but he's still not a cop. And most of these guys that are in those positions, that was the dream, was to be in law enforcement. And so there's a kid that's missing, and it's from a Worcester couple, and the boyfriend is in jail on a drug charge. And so Scanlon comes up with a very good plan to try to get information out of this guy because they believe the kid was murdered. And so he plants a snitch in the cell next to him and works out a deal with the snitch to get the snitch to probe him for information. And it works. The guy that's in the boyfriend that's in jail tells the snitch that he left the body inside a suitcase and threw it out on I-190 just outside of Worcester. So Scanlon and a partner from the sheriff's department go out there a couple of days and they find the suitcase. And at that moment, they do the right thing and they go to the detectives. They were in a little bit of mild trouble for that, though. It came out in court because they were never authorized to be out in the field searching for evidence like that. By the book, what they had to do is once they had that information from the snitch, they were supposed to feed that to the detectives unit in Worcester, or at least the local police, to go out and take care of that. And but they did it on their own. So there's a little bit of an attempt to kind of be the hero here. And, I don't think we should become too heavy on that. It's at the end of the day, he succeeded and they did convict that guy for murdering the kid. So in a sense, he was the hero, but you do see this kind of eagerness to insert himself into events. And I think that's what came into play here again in the Karen Reed case. He's hanging around in the bars over the next couple of days after John's death. And people are coming in and out and talking in whispers, and this urban legend is starting to grow, and he's picking up on it. So he runs to Yannetti with it. And what does Yannetti do? He exploits it, right? That's what a defense attorney is going to do. So now he assigns his private investigator, Mikowski, to start picking up more details on this, that they can start creating a narrative about the third-party culprit. And Karen is super, super involved as a defendant. She's educated and intelligent, and she's not the type to just sit back and let her team do it. So she's spending hour after hour, pouring through social media. Eventually, she finds connections between the Proctors and the Alberts. And so you have a whole team that's working here to try to stitch together this narrative. And that's how it began. So let's get to this charging document. I'm sorry, this is the motion for Brian's phone. All right. And it's interesting because you'll see that. So basically, this is what Turtle Boy 5 days later ran with in his very first article on this case. It's the entire defense theory. But you'll see some of it's involved a little bit and changed over time. And and pretty much all of it, I would say, has been debunked, but we'll see. The product, so they're looking for the cell phones in the possession or used by Brian in that period, so that their expert, Rich Green, may conduct a forensic examination. So they're listing all the stuff that they're going to try to get out of it. Now, here is the beginning. You see it up on the screen of Karen Reed conspiracy theory. Begins with the expression, how long to die in the cold. So this seems to have been written by Yannetti because Yannetti has a little bit of a flair like that. This is how he began his opening remarks. My client was framed. And so he begins right here, bold, underline, How long to die in the cold? This is like a hook, right? If you're writing a story, this is a hook. So you're hooking the judge here, or you're attempting to. New revelations from Jennifer McCabe's cell phone must reverse the trajectory of this case. Evidence obtained from an analysis of the complete forensic image of Jennifer McCabe's cell phone, which the Massachusetts State Police and Norfolk County District Attorney's Office withheld from the defense for more than a year, exculpates Miss Reed and decisively implicates Jennifer McCabe, Jennifer McCabe and Brian Albert in the murder of John O'Keefe. Come right out and say it there. So they're pointing the finger right at these people and saying they are the murderers. I just, again, you got to take a quick sip of drink, but stunning to me. I could not do this I guess I couldn't be a defense lawyer to sit there and just knowingly point the finger on such spurious evidence at innocent people. I could never do this. All right. In spite of the fact that O'Keefe was found dead on the front lawn of Boston police officer Brian Albert, a highly trained boxer and fighter, which he's not. I mean, he's a tough guy, but he's not a highly trained boxer. They took a little bit of that video that he did on Boston's Finest, but apparently that was just kind of a clip. And actually, if you look at it, you can tell he's not a trained fighter. And I'm certainly not either, but we've all watched him. And he's going in the rink with a trained fighter just to spar for a few minutes. And you could tell he's not. With deep familial and personal ties to the Canton Police Department and the Massachusetts State Police. So obviously his brother is a detective on the Canton Police Department, so that's true on that. But on the Canton Police, to the Mass State Police, the only thing they ever found was that Michael Proctor's sister is friends with Chris Albert's wife and her sister. But they're entitled to exaggerate, Law enforcement has utterly failed to treat Mr. Albert and his family members who were present on the night in question as suspects. Instead, law enforcement immediately arrested Miss Reed based on, in no small part, on incriminating statements attributed to her by one of the actual conspirators in O'Keefe's murder, Brian Albert's sister-in-law, Jen McCabe. So there they are. They're coming right out. She is an actual conspirator, according to O'Keefe. Can you imagine how it feels like to be an innocent person and reading that? Can you imagine what that's like? Can you imagine what it's like to read that about your mother, about your wife, your sister? I mean, just forget about. A lot of people look at the characters in this case as just kind of characters in some theater. They're not real. But just imagine what it's like if someone who is innocent suddenly has to read that, put out by high-priced attorneys and submitted to a judge. As this court is well aware, Ms. Reed has always maintained that she dropped off O'Keefe at Brian Albert's residence located at 34 Fairview Road just after midnight on January 29th, and frustratedly left without him when he failed to answer any of her calls. That has been disproved. Okay? The first call came at 12:33. She also has claimed that there were texts. There were no texts. The first text came, I could be off by a minute or two here, but I believe it was 12:53, but it's somewhere in the 12:50s. Her phone logged into John's Wi-Fi at 12:36. So she was near the house by 12:36. So the first call was at 12:33. So unless she managed to drive home in 3 minutes, almost certainly she was on the road when she made that call. So the idea of her sitting out in front, waiting for John who's gone into the house and texting and calling him, it's just a lie. It's a lie that's debunked by the evidence. So presuming that he had proceeded into the house for the party, Brian Albert, Jennifer McCabe, and Matthew McCabe, all of whom were present at the Albert residence at the night in question, have maintained that O'Keefe never entered the residence. People still go over this here, but GPS shows that the phone never went in the evidence when it went to the residence. So you really have to really stretch things to think, to understand, to believe that John went into the residence and then ended up on his phone at the edge of the property because his phone was found underneath him. So it's a reach, right? And then you also have to believe that every single one of those, I think 9 witnesses in the house were lying. It's very unlikely. So you're already starting out here without any of the other evidence in believing something that is very unlikely. And they cite the interviews to back up what they were saying. They all similarly claimed that he had no reason to suspect any sort of foul play, that they had no reason to suspect any sort of foul play until O'Keefe's body was discovered the next morning at 6:04. Previously withheld information and data obtained from an analysis of Jen McCabe's phone paints a much darker picture of what actually transpired. All right, so pause for a second here just to point out. So this is the first official version of the conspiracy theory, third-party culprit theory, if you prefer, and it comes on April 12th of 2023. By this point, they had already pitched their conspiracy theory to first U.S. Attorney Josh Levy. And that was in August of 2022. Sorry about the interruption. So that was in August of 2022. That's, what's that, 8-9 months before they presented this theory. Now, when they went into to pitch that to Josh Levy, they did not have any of this data that they're going to talk about here. So Rich Green didn't perform his extraction until March of 2023. 2023. So 7, 8, 9 months after the feds had already got on this. So what exactly did they give the feds? This is something I want you guys to keep asking here, because somehow they gave the feds enough to actually force them to get them to agree to launch this massive investigation. So by December of 2022, the feds were already issuing subpoenas for 7 people who the defense lists as conspirators. What evidence predicated that? What evidence predicated them to get the FBI involved here? It remains baffling, and you're not going to see it in this document. This document is built almost entirely on the data that wasn't available in August of 2022, and a little bit on the wounds. So you're going to tell me the feds launched this just because of the autopsy photos that suggested John was attacked by a dog? That's stunning to me. There has to be more to this story. Did they present Scanlon as a whistleblower when in fact Scanlon had already refused to sign any affidavits and said he didn't know anything? So did they falsely present him? Yannetti is still trying to do this in recent interviews, basically suggest that Scanlon is scared and he's hiding the stuff. But there's no indication that Scanlon ever knew anything. That's what he has said on the record to trooper interviews, that he never had any information. So are we to believe that Josh Levy, now the U.S. attorney that likes to hold press conferences every couple months, loves press conferences? I've never seen a U.S. attorney hold more press conferences. Are we to believe that this guy was duped by this really simple explanation that didn't even have any of this weird data? I don't know. Strange things, man. Strange things. So they're talking about how long to die in the cold. Jennifer McCabe explicitly told law enforcement that she did not think much of O'Keefe's failure to enter the residence that night and assumed that O'Keefe and Miss Reed simply decided to go home. Well, of course. It's an after-hours party. Someone doesn't make it. That's what you're assuming. Nothing weird about that. But then he says, however, 3 hours before Jennifer McCabe had any reason to suspect O'Keefe hadn't gone home with Miss Reed, 3 hours before she inserted herself. This is just stunning. And the hapless turtle just ran with this too. 3 hours before she inserted herself into Miss Reed's search for O'Keefe and delayed her return to the Albert residence. So what was that about? All right. So at 5, Karen calls, I think it was at 4:57. Karen calls Jen McCabe, wakes her up, and says John's missing. But the defense describes it as Jen McCabe inserting herself into it. It's bizarre, right? The defense dances as close to dishonesty as they can without getting sanctioned all the time. They've been doing it for this whole case. Maybe that's normal with defense attorneys. I don't know. I'm not trying to smear them, but this is yet another disturbing. We saw the same thing. Some very good attorneys that were in the Delphi murders that smeared innocent people and put out some very bizarre theories. Is it always fair and love and lawfare? Is that how it works here? You get to smear innocent people and create these falsehoods just to get your client off. Is that what it means to defend your client with the most vigor? I guess. So, and then delayed the return to the Albert residence. But let's flip this on its head. Okay. So what happened was when Karen arrived at the McCabe house, she was determined to go to 34 Fairview. Now, why wouldn't she because she believed because she's saying that's where I last saw John. But you can ask, and so before we even ask that, so, and Jen McCabe and also Kerry Roberts, who had just arrived, were like, well, no, why would he be there? They just couldn't believe it. They believed he must be back at home and you just didn't see him. You're drunk. They could tell she was drunk and they're just thinking she's having an episode. She's waking up. She's freaking out over something when he's just sleeping on the couch in the house somewhere. But they couldn't believe the idea that John might still be at 34 Fairview. So that's what the defense, though, says. That's them delaying her return to 34 Fairview by making them go back to John's house first. It's crazy. But you can ask, why if Karen has left, she claims she didn't go back to 34 Fairview. Why didn't she go to 34 Fairview? Why would she go to McCabe's insisting we got to go to 34 Fairview? You got to drive pretty much in the opposite direction to get to the McCabe's. Would have been much easier just to drive to 34 Fairview, which the prosecution believes she did. There's no absolute proof of that yet. There may be with the new vehicle data, maybe not. She was heading roughly in that direction. But certainly if you're a Karen Reed believer and you believe that she did not go to 34 Fairview, then you have to ask yourself, why did she go to the McCabe's just to say, let's go to 34 Fairview? Does that really make sense? All right, 3 hours before her discovery. So let's admit that and I've always said, and I still say it now, had that search been real, had Jen actually searched at 227 for how long to die in the cold, then yes, she knew. I don't believe that there would be that it could be a coincidence. If you could prove to me that search was made, then I would believe somehow Jen McCabe knew that John either was dying in the cold or was soon to be. That was the crux of the case. And so back in the summer of 2022, not knowing much about data, I believed, well, data is just data. But then we saw Adam Lally get in court and say, no, we dispute this. And we have an independent expert who they were talking about was Jessica Hyde at the time, who will explain to you why that data is in error, that search was not made at 227. Because there were 3 searches made, and Rich Green is saying that one was made at 627 and the other 2 were made at 623. That's not very logical. So they had to try to, odds are they were made at the same time because there were slightly different misspellings to each one. So the defense tries to posit weirdly that the subsequent searches at 623, which they don't dispute, were an effort to somehow cover up the older one. Now that's just weird. That wouldn't even cover it up. So it doesn't make sense that she would think that, but they have to have that explanation because otherwise any common sense person is going to say, no, all 3 searches were made at the same time at 623. So then they said, what's even more shocking is that the very next day, before turning her phone over to law enforcement, It said Miss McCabe took calculated steps to purge her phone of this inculpatory search and at the same time attempted to delete her communications with Brian Albert and remove a screenshot of his contact information from her phone, which she had obviously shared with someone that morning. Again, you can't trust defense lawyers. I'm sorry. You just can't. You can't trust police. Don't ever give your phone up. Make them fight for your phone, kicking and screaming. Never turn over your phone. Jen McCabe didn't have to turn over her phone. She did it because she trusted the system. But data is complicated. And there's always, my phone is sitting here and I'm not using it, but there's probably shit going on there that I don't know about. And if I start making a call now, there's going to be other stuff moving around that I'm not controlling. It's a computer. It's a very complicated thing. And folders are being filled and automatically moved, and files are being moved and being rewritten on its own. I don't have to explain how. I don't know how. But I know that that's how computers work. And so this was explained in the trial by Ian Whiffen, the senior forensic data guy from Celebrite, and that's the tool that law enforcement and everybody used, including Rich Green, to come up with this. So he explained that there were no deletions that were made as a result of a human being. There were just things being moving around in there, and there was no data missing. But the defense is going to try to play this up because people are gullible. In light of this new information, the Norfolk County District Attorney's Office should immediately do what's right and file a nolle prosequi. That means drop the prosecution, I believe. That's Latin. We'll have to consult Tom GPT on this. And but I believe that's Latin for no prosecution. Short of that just result, Miss Reed's constitutional right to defend herself against these false allegations demand that she be permitted to obtain the critical information that law enforcement failed to obtain and preserve from the outset, namely communications and location information associated with the actual perpetrators of this crime, Jennifer McCabe and Brian Albert. The requested information will undoubtedly further implicate Jennifer McCabe, Brian Albert, and others in the murder of John O'Keefe and the sinister cover-up that resulted in these false charges being brought against Mrs. Reed. I could never, in the shoes of David Yannetti, or Alan Jackson, I'm sorry, I could never write those words. I could never sign off on that. I think it's disgusting because they know better. Ms. Reed stands charged with the following crimes. All right, let me list the crimes here. Oh, this is interesting here. So they're saying that the prosecution theories, all right, because this is, you'll see this is a little bit different. So the two theories advanced by the Commonwealth, one, that Miss Reed became suddenly angry with O'Keefe outside the home of Boston police officer Brian Albert and reversed into him with her vehicle, shattering her taillight by striking his head before fleeing the scene. So I don't know what they were basing that off of, because we know the prosecution that wasn't their theory at the trial. No, but maybe they did say something earlier. I don't know. But maybe the defense just falsely assumed that, because I myself for months just believed that the taillight was shattered by John's head. And then the state told us, no, the frozen ground was the source of the head injury. But certainly at this time, the defense believed that that's what the state's theory was. Number 2 on that list, Karen became suddenly angry with O'Keefe outside Brian Albert's residence and struck O'Keefe in the head with a cocktail glass. Oh, so they're saying that there was a second theory, that she struck John in the head with a cocktail glass before reversing into him with her vehicle, shattering her taillight and fleeing the scene. Well, yeah, I don't think the state's saying any of those. I don't know if they ever said any of those things, but they're certainly not saying it now. O'Keefe was found unresponsive in the early morning hours of January 29th. Contrary to the Commonwealth's theories, photographs suggests that he was beaten severely and left for dead, having sustained blunt force injuries to both sides of his face, as well as the back of his head. Well, that's not at all what the medical examiner or the specialist, I forget her name, the one with the skull tattoo on her arm, who studied the head and the brain. It's a commonly known thing where you get a serious head injury, which causes the brain to swell. And as the brain swells, because it's contained inside this hard case, more blood vessels burst, which leads to more swelling. And eventually it leads to swelling that reaches all the way to the front part of the brain. And you get that raccoon look that they talk about that is well known to hospital workers and presumably well known to the defense team as they signed off on this. But they're saying that those were the results of trauma to the front of the face. And that is not at all what the medical examiners, and that's not what the evidence shows either. O'Keefe also suffered. So there's in addition to suffering numerous defensive wounds on his hands, consistent with a brutal fight. No. He's got a bruise on the back of his right hand. That's it. There's no abrasions on his knuckles. None. There's no injuries on the left hand. There's no abrasions on the right knuckles. There's just a bruise on the back of his hand, and it's hard to imagine. Listen, I worked many years in the bar industry, been around some fights, a lot of them. And the idea that you get in a fight with someone and the only bruise you're going to get is on the back of your hand, I don't even know how you'd get it on the back of your hand. I never got any there. I mean, it's just, it doesn't make sense. Then it says O'Keefe suffered a cluster of deep scratches and puncture wounds to his right arm. So here's where they're going to come in with the dog theory. These injuries to O'Keefe's right arm are consistent with bite marks and or claw marks from an animal, more specifically a dog. And as part of the motion here, they're trying to get, at the time, information from the clerk, the Canton Animal Control and the Canton Clerk's office to try to learn about what fights the dog may have been in. Four months after O'Keefe's death, Brian Albert went to great lengths to dispose of critical evidence by making sure Chloe, his family dog of 7 years, simply disappeared. This is another reason why this theory took off, right? Because it's so easy for the defense to just kind of create these elements and make them look dark and mysterious. But Chloe is still alive and is in Vermont. And if the defense wanted to, they could go up there and get their own dental impression, get their own DNA. There's nothing stopping the defense from doing that. The reason they don't do it is because it's more, they know it's not true, so it's more convenient for them to just create this vague impression. If you're cooking up a defense third-party culprit scheme, you don't want to get too specific. You don't want to dig too hard. You just want to create enough to create reasonable doubt. You're not trying to solve the case, because if you solve the case, it might end up leading back to your own client. So you're just trying to get just enough evidence. You don't want to. Rich Green didn't dig too hard looking into that data either. The ARCA guys didn't dig too hard. They never looked at the vehicle data. So it's just getting just what you need and no more. Let me just make sure my mic is working. All right, good. Hang in there and chat, guys. I haven't been able to see it. Looking now quickly. Rena, hi, good to see you. And I hope you can make it at 9 again. And Jen says, Kevin, if they really believe Chloe bite John, why didn't they go get the bite impressions? Yeah, exactly. Thank you, Jennifer. And RL, I hope you email me that so I can, if you haven't managed. Oh, you have, looks like you figured it out, because I think you got the green shade here. So thank you. Welcome aboard as a member. And Kara says, free Chloe. Well, hopefully Chloe is happy. So let me go back to the document so I can't see if If you're trying to say something to me, I won't see it now, so don't get mad. The events that transpired the night before O'Keefe's death on January 29th have always been largely undisputed. The evidence incontrovertibly establishes that on the evening of January 28th, so they went to the waterfall. All right, we can just kind of skim through this. Witnesses gave conflicting accounts regarding whether O'Keefe actually exited the vehicle and made his way into the Albert residence. Not really. They actually gave a consistent account, but what they're going to base this on is the fact that when the truck that Ryan was in drove by where Karen was parked, they didn't see John. He didn't see John. There's nothing conflicting. Ryan Nagel, one of the only percipient witnesses present on the night in question, who is not closely related to the Alberts. Well, his sister's not related to the Alberts, and neither is Sarah Levinson. According to Mr. Nagel's interview with police, he recalled seeing a set of headlights of a mid-sized black SUV coming from the opposite direction. So remember, Karen, they're actually start out going in the same direction, but Karen missed the left-hand turn onto Fairview, and so had to do a 3-point turn on Cedar Crest just after that. And so when they come back, and now she's taking a right-hand turn, that's when Ryan Nagel is arriving. And she has the right of way, so he lets her go. But just remember that 3-point turn, as we've talked about many times, because it's a crucial piece of evidence that really creates kind of a bulletproof correlation between the vehicle data and the phone data. So the truck, an F-150, follows, and then they realize they're going to the same address. He and his friends remained parked outside the driveway for approximately 5 minutes, at which point his sister came out to the Albert residence and told him she was going to spend the night and no longer needed a ride. So one of the things that we know from John's phone is that Karen did not stop in front of the driveway for long. I think I don't have the date in front of me, but it's like 25 seconds, 25 seconds. So she pulls up in front of the driveway, and depending on if you believe her version of events, John jumps out right there, and then she drives up. Or the other, if you believe the prosecution's version of events, she sees the pickup truck behind her, so she pulls forward. But she didn't just pull a little bit forward. She pulled all the way to the edge of the property, and she was there by before 12:25. Actually, I think about maybe 15 seconds before. And so they're already in that position where John would be found. So when he and his friends left shortly thereafter, he observed a woman sitting alone in the SUV, the Lexus, outside the residence. He further reported that he did not observe any damage to her vehicle, hear screams, or otherwise observe any altercation between Mr. and Mrs. O'Keefe. So he never saw John. He didn't see John get dropped off in the driveway. Seems like he would have, but you never know what someone's going to see. And but also didn't see John walking along the road while they were leaving. Didn't see John sitting in the car. So, but what seems almost certain is that John was still alive at that point. And so the insinuation here by the defense is that he had already been struck, or not that he'd already been struck, but that the state was saying that he'd already been struck. And that's why they're saying, well, he didn't hear any screams or any accidents. But John stopped moving at 12:32 and 16 seconds. And when you look at the vehicle data, John was struck 8 minutes and 8 seconds after the 3-point turn on Cedar Crest, which was roughly around 12:24. So it's within, say, 3 or 4 seconds at 12:32 and 10, 11, 12 seconds, somewhere around that time. That's when is the telltale signature that John was struck. So Ryan Nagel, if they were there they say they were there for about 5 minutes. So they were gone by then. If they were still there, so they arrived at 12:24, that's 8 minutes later. So, this, I guess, so the more likely thing is that the pickup truck drove by just before John got out of the car, or as John was getting out of the car, and then they left, and then the accident happened. But the timeline, allows for the possibility that the truck could have been there at 12:32, because they don't know for sure how long they were there, but it really wouldn't make sense because they would have seen her going in reverse for 62 feet. So again, it says she always maintained that she dropped O'Keefe off at the Albert residence and waited for him to scope out the residence and make sure that they were there at the correct house and weren't imposing. Now, again, what else is missing here? Karen has been trying to say, let me take that back. Karen's minions have been trying to say, and her defense team tried to say at the trial, that John was ambushed, that Brian Higgins and Brian Albert were planning this attack and were practicing for it at the waterfall. All right. They now try to show a video that seems to show Brian Higgins pointing and being angry while he's leaving. And Brian Albert kind of grabs him and seems to say, settle down, buddy, or something like that. And John O'Keefe the question is, was he pointing at John O'Keefe? Because John O'Keefe was still sitting at the bar with Karen, or sitting at the table with Karen. So as someone who's watched many, many, many hundreds of hours of surveillance videos in bars, I could look at that and say, yeah, it looks kind of like that. It looks like he could be angry, and it looks like he could be pointing in that direction. And he could have been mad knowing that Karen was ignoring him now because he had texted her saying, what's up, or something like that. So he could have been angry now that he had enough drinks in him. However, if he was pointing at John in anger with Karen sitting with him, Karen would have known it. All right. So why would they go back to 34 Fairview knowing that Higgins was angry at them? Angry at John or whatever. And if they did, why isn't that in the statement? Why wouldn't she say something like, well, we knew that Brian Higgins was angry at us. We saw them wound up at the bar. So we talked about it on the drive over. And John just really wanted to go in. He thought maybe he could calm things down or settle things. But there's no mention of that. There's no mention of that at all. She gives a specific version of the story that says here they were trying to scope out the residence to make sure that it was the correct house and they weren't imposing. So if there was an early form of confrontation at the waterfall, Karen and John absolutely would have been talking about that on the drive there. In fact, they would have been probably saying, geez, is it a good idea? Karen would have been rightly saying, it's not a good idea to go in here. They're pretty mad at you. Even if John was because John seemed like a kind of guy that probably people couldn't stay mad at. So so you could, under that kind of a theory, say that John was suggesting, I can go in and calm things down. But Karen doesn't tell a story like that. That story could make sense, but Karen didn't tell it. She's telling something completely different. So again, it says, after calling O'Keefe several times and becoming frustrated with his failure to answer or otherwise respond to her, Miss Reed eventually left. That's a lie. The earliest call was at 12:33. So we know this now. But we also should, so in the summer of 2022, Turtle Boy reported, and all of his information was coming straight from Karen. Turtle Boy reported that Karen got home at 12:42. And the way they knew that, she said, was because you can hear her boots on the ground and the garage door closing. Now, there is a voicemail at 12:42 that does seem to suggest that. So, but it looks like the defense at the time maybe even of preparing this motion here, was unaware that Karen's phone had logged into the Wi-Fi at 12:36. Because if Karen got home at 12:42, then you actually could say that Karen called several times, because Karen, as she drove home, called like every 30 seconds. She called multiple times to see if John would pick up. So maybe they didn't know. at the time when they said this, but we now know that that is absolutely false. There's no way that Karen was sitting out there making calls. Just isn't true. So the Commonwealth, it says, finally produced a forensic image of O'Keefe's phone to the defense, albeit a full year after the phone was taken into law enforcement custody. Well, I would have to see what the prosecution's explanation for that, but I can maybe give a suggestion. The crime happened on January 29th. The phone was confiscated on January 29th. However, she did not give them the password. And they have to use, I forget the name of it, there's a device that cycles through trying all the passwords until eventually the machine finds it. But they didn't break into her phone. They didn't break through that password until August. So 7 months later, more than 7 months later, maybe 7.5 months later. So that would probably explain the delay in getting her the data. They didn't have it. But they don't mention that here. So Rich Green says that the data that he found says that John got out of the car and walked somewhere in the early morning at a point in time when his location was consistent with being in the vicinity of the Albert residence. This is not true. So John they were driving to try to find the house. They're driving up Dedham Street. And the way to get to the house would be to turn left onto Cedar Crest and then follow that all the way down until you turn left onto Fairview. But they obviously weren't quite sure where to go. And it was right around the time that as they were passing the intersection, they should have turned left onto Cedar Crest, but as they weren't sure where to go, so they passed it. And at that moment, John entered in the address into Waze. And so the address where he put it in, I think, was 138 Dedham Street. And so now it has to give him directions. It doesn't have him turn to go back to Cedar Crest. It has him go up and take a left on Maplecroft or Maplethorpe or something like that. And then from there, it has him turn onto Oakdale. And then from Oakdale, you take a right onto Cedar Crest. But so at that spot where they put in, so the time was about 12:20 and 8 seconds. So let's call it 12:20. So at 12:20, John puts in to Waze 34 Fairview. They're a little over a mile away. So it's going to take them 4 minutes to get there. Keep that time in mind. So that means if all goes well, they'll get there about 12:24. But as we know, she eventually missed the turn and had to do a 3-point turn. So that lost her maybe 20 or 30 seconds. So it's during the time when Rich Green has John going up and down stairs is actually at 12:22. And that's physically, that's impossible. We know, like I said, you know how accurate Waze is. You put in the time, the location, it's accessing your GPS to determine your route, and it's got the time. So we know exactly what time John put into Waze the address, and we know where they were. And there's no way they could have reached 34 Fairview. So unless they stopped at some other house halfway there and went up and down stairs, that information is just a misinterpretation by the health app, which is not uncommon because the health app is taking a bunch of signals from your phone and trying to interpret what you're doing. That's why it's prone to error. If you're driving slow, if there's pressure changes, there's a lot of things that could lead to it. So this is just all a bunch of bullshit data. This says that he took his last steps at 12:31. So again, you get into the complexities of looking at this. He died. He was found near the spot where Karen parked. We know from the GPS. So he had already reached his last GPS. The GPS coordinates come with about a 15-foot margin of error, and you can be anywhere within that circle. So you can be walking around in that circle, but the GPS coordinates won't change. So the GPS, he had already reached that position before 12:25, and so I forget that exact time. It was like 12:24 and 48 or something like that. So before 12:25, he had already reached the final place that he would be found. Now that doesn't mean he didn't move at all. It's within a margin of error there. So at some point he got out of the car, but he didn't go very far. All right, so since I'm kind of almost rupping against 9, let me skip through to see if there's the important things. Most of the stuff you all know. All right. So they're talking about the McCabe's gave Sarah Levinson and Julie Nagel a ride home. And this is the way the defense puts it. Moreover, she didn't drive directly home with her husband as she initially claimed. Instead, the McCabe's made the executive decision at 2 a.m. in a snowstorm. It was not a dusting of snow, to drop off two of Brian Albert Jr.'s friends who were in attendance at the party. Passing O'Keefe's residence at One Meadows on their way home. They try to make all this normal, mundane stuff look nefarious. I don't know how decent people could do that. The McCabe's clearly wanted to know whether Miss Reed would be home to notice if and when John O'Keefe failed to return home. So again, one of the things that is a guiding rule for me is there are no geniuses. If you concoct some kind of a defense, some kind of a theory about a crime that requires genius, levels of genius planning or genius activity, rethink your theory. When it comes to criminal activity, there are no geniuses, especially on something spontaneous like this after a night of drinking. That's not to say that these people aren't smart, and they could even be a genius, but in their possible conduct of a conspiracy, there are no geniuses. And if your theory requires that, rethink it. So if you guys watch, and we'll probably go a little past 9 before we start the members only show, so I can get through most of this document. So just clearly speculative here. The idea that the McCabe's had to drive by the O'Keefe residence to make sure that Karen hadn't left. There's no evidence of that. After passing by the deceased's home on One Meadows, location data obtained from her phone, from Jen's phone, shows she arrived back at her home. When questioned by law enforcement as to why she never made it to the party, she didn't think of anything. Of course, they go back into 227. It's crazy. She's supposedly Googling this at the same time. She's planning this murder or part of this murder conspiracy that she's very likely to get caught in and is going to go to prison with her husband, and their kids are not going to have parents. And yet her health app shows her heart rate never changes. And she's just calmly researching her daughter's basketball league. It doesn't make sense, and it's really embarrassing to think that after all this time, there are people that still believe this. Contrary to her assertions to law enforcement, she obviously had a lot on her mind. Data taken from her Apple Watch establishes that she was up much of the night, pacing. So the defense never tried to suggest this at trial. This is something they put in here. It's absurd. It's absurd. But it's so easy to willfully misread data. And that's what they do. Meanwhile, Miss Reed, the only person with reason to believe O'Keefe was actually missing, grew increasingly concerned with O'Keefe's failure to return home to his children and answer her many phone calls and text messages. After a fitful night of sleep, Miss Reed began frantically calling John's friends shortly before 5. course, she also called her mom. Jennifer McCabe was conveniently awake despite a night of drinking. But how do you know that? That's crazy. Just the number of assertions they make here. How could they know that Jen McCabe was awake? It's absurd. It's because they're going to say because of the pacing, which didn't exist, and they didn't bring up in trial. After picking up the call, the overly helpful Miss McCabe jumped out of bed. So they're saying she's awake, but they know she's in bed. These people are sick. And inserted herself into the search for O'Keefe. It's Karen that woke her up. It's Karen that drove to her house. It's not like Jen went down and got in the car and raced over to Karen's house to keep her there. No. I don't really understand how normal people believe this stuff. Making every effort to delay Karen in returning to the Albert residence to look for him, and ensuring that she was in control of the narrative provided to police. See, again, they've turning her into Hannibal Lecter. And this is, I don't think Turtle Boy is an idiot. I think he's a reasonably intelligent guy. But only an idiot would believe this stuff. But what makes someone that's not an idiot believe something foolish is when they see their own interest. Maybe that's the case with Yannetti here too, right? There is no way a normal person would believe any of this. But Turtle Boy saw a star, saw opportunity in this. This was going to be his big thing. It doesn't make sense for a normal person to believe any of this stuff. During that call, Miss McCabe suggested that a hysterical Karen drive all the way across the town at 5 a.m. to her own residence. Miss McCabe insisted they drive Miss Reed's car back to the O'Keefe's residence. And that was another perfectly valid reason to go back. Karen was drunk and hysterical. Get that car back there and get into one car. Buying time to make sure John wouldn't live to tell this court what happened to him. Oh, my God. This is like reading a really bad movie script, which I've read a lot of them. It's just stunning. Jen McCabe is delaying so that John, who they've put on the house on the lone lawn to die, to make sure he dies. Well, if you're worried about him living and telling his story, don't you just kill him before you put him out on the lawn? Don't you just do like Tony Soprano did in Sopranos to Christopher when he just covered his nose and his mouth and killed him? You mean to tell me that Brian Higgins, who was a trained EMT, couldn't figure out how to do that? You mean that Brian Albert, a Gulf War veteran, elite cop, couldn't figure out how to just quietly kill this guy in a way that wouldn't leave a mark? It's crazy. As the women pulled up to Brian Albert's house, Miss Reed spotted an unconscious O'Keefe lying face up on his back in front of the yard. While Karen and Kerry raced to him and attempted to render aid, Jen curiously remained in the vehicle, dialed 911, and began controlling the narrative. This is insane. She remained in the vehicle to call 911, which was necessary, and then went out to help. God. In her initial statement to Proctor, close friend of the Alberts and McCabes, there has never been any link shown between Proctor and the McCabes. Never. There's the picture that the defense famously showed saying that it was Michael Proctor at some party with the McCabe girls around him, but it wasn't presented at trial. And the McCabes have consistently said that those were not their daughters. So just a falsehood that they put in here. There's no connection between the McCabe's and the Proctors. Well, there is a connection now. There was no connection at this point. She describes Karen walking in, into the bar, holding a drinking glass. So they're, ooh, look at that. They're trying to set her up. Jen falsely tells Trooper Proctor that Miss Reed claimed she went home alone that night and last saw John at the waterfall. Well, the defense is saying that's false, but that was actually verified by John's niece, Kaylee, who heard the same thing. So again, this is just a work of fiction. Miss McCabe tells Trooper Proctor that while they were searching for John, Karen repeatedly asked, could I have hit him? Did I hit him? Well, I mean, I don't think anybody really dismisses this anymore because Kerry Roberts heard that. Kerry Roberts was not connected to the McCabes, barely knew them. Kerry Roberts was closely connected to the O'Keefes, not just John, but the whole family. And so there's no reason Kerry Roberts could be part of this conspiracy, this alleged conspiracy, right? But in addition, it's very similar to what Karen was saying at the scene that was heard by by 5 first responders. According to Nicole Albert's statement, she and her husband were still in bed when Jen came in and woke them up. However, cell records established that immediately after disconnecting with 911 dispatch, Jennifer McCabe actually made 2 calls to her sister. And, of course, one to Brian. That was at 6:07 and 6:08. Both of which were answered by someone and subsequently deleted. Aha! Right? False. It's just not true. And Turtle Boy doesn't care about the truth. The defense doesn't care about the truth. That was explained at trial over and over again through multiple witnesses. When you call someone and it reaches voicemail, your phone will show that the call was answered. The receivers will not show that because they didn't answer the call. But your call will show that. And this was established with multiple call links during the trial. You've reached voicemail. And so your phone lists that as answered. Those calls were, and nothing was deleted. If it was deleted, how do we know about it, right? So obviously it wasn't deleted. Yeah, more stuff about the same thing, deletions. This is their theory on, so Jen said that Karen immediately yelled at them inside the vehicle, how long do you have to be outside to die from hypothermia? Well, this was confirmed in another way that she was asking that question because on about 15, 20 minutes later on the ambulance, she asked the paramedic the same exact thing. And that's a completely separate thing. You know, Jen McCabe was not on the ambulance. She was in the house at that point. It was just Karen and the EMT on there. And the EMT said Karen was asking that same question. So that confirms that this is what she was asking Jen McCabe. It's not reasonable to believe that the defense explanation here. It's not normal. So they said that Jen knew how devastating it would be if the wrong person in law enforcement discovered that she Googled how long to die in the cold hours before she claims to have found the body in the snow. Thus, in an attempt to deflect suspicion and justify this incredibly incriminating Google search, she reverted to blaming everything on Miss Reed. Unfortunately for Jen, her decision to Google how long to die in the cold 2 hours after O'Keefe made his way into the Albert residence was hers and hers alone. again, the Celebrite version of the software that the state had did not find that. A later version that Rich Green used did find that, but that has since been corrected by Celebrite. And so it would no longer find that. It's just, there's really no, I don't even know if they'll try to do this in the trial. I guess they'll try on the chance that it sticks, but there's no really sane way to try to argue that Jen made that search at 227. The defense is not suggesting that Jennifer McCabe killed O'Keefe and covered up his murder alone. The Commonwealth and contacts that Jennifer McCabe intentionally deleted from her phone in the 4 days between John's death and her decision to turn her phone over to law enforcement are key to uncovering what transpired. As set forth more fully below, Jen intentionally sanitized her phone of her contacts with Brian and Nicole. None of that happened. The only reasonable inference as to why Jen would intentionally tamper with evidence she knew she was providing to law enforcement is because, like her 227 search, she and Brian had taken calculating steps to hide incriminating information. Look, she didn't have to give over her phone. So she could have just said no. And just like the court never ordered Brian to, the court would have never had a reason to order Jen to turn over her phone. She wasn't suspected of taking place in any crime. So thinking, as most of us would, that that you're innocent, so you're not going to find anything wrong. We don't know. Like, this stuff that's going on inside your phone that a shrewd or tricky defense data analyst is going to take and twist into something that makes it look like something you didn't do. Let's see. We're going to end this show in a moment so we can go to the members only show. Just trying to make sure we get to the end of this document. Oh, this one is rich. Actions taken by Brian Albert and his family to destroy evidence and engage in witness intimidation over the course of the last year should be extremely troubling to this court and unquestionably further support the necessity of immediately issuing a summons for Brian's phone. All right. It's amazing that they pull up witness intimidation because as this document was being turned in, they were just launching an effort with Turtle Boy to stir up a mob. So within weeks of this document being written, less than a month, they'd be launching plans to intimidate witnesses. Now, to what degree Karen's team took part of that or knew about it? Well, they certainly knew it when it was happening. And they didn't break off communications with Turtle at all. And Turtle was in regular contact with Jackson, Yannetti, but most importantly, Karen. I think something like 179 calls with Karen, but then numerous, impossible to count now, text messages over the encryption app called Signal. And the rest is just a legal argument. All right, so we'll get to, the rest is just legal argument as to why this has to be here. So, just got to make sure. So I'm getting the messages from people and, all right, so what we're going to do here is let me close this. Let me just get to the thank yous here for the people that signed up for new members. So Victoria from Dublin, welcome, thank you. And Miss Trial, Frank Perry, Ashley, Steve, Maui Swift gifted memberships. Thank you, Maui. And May Britt Madsen. That's a really cool name. RL, Ash Perkins, Rena, I think was already, but if I see you're not a member, Rena, if you want to, if you're available and you want to join the show, please message me and I'll send you the backstage link. Rena also says, can they bring Arca back without all the evidence this time? Don't think Bev will allow it. That's a really interesting question as to how the defense and how the prosecution is going to handle Arca. Assuming they'll be back. It's a unique thing because they weren't paid by the defense or hired by the defense. They were hired by the feds. I think if I was the state, I would consider hiring them and giving them giving them all the evidence, giving them the vehicle data, and see if that changes their analysis. But it's hard to. That's a gamble though, because it's a human nature thing everybody wants to, once they've taken a position on something, they want to dig in their heels. Nobody wants to be embarrassed. So those guys don't want to come on the stand and say, well, we were wrong before. So I don't know. There's a risk with it, right? Marlene, thank you very much. I appreciate it. Ken says 3-point turn registered an event on the Lexus VCH. Karen was rage shifting. I think he meant shifting prior to the 3-point turn. Yes. So in the entire time that Karen owned the vehicle, there were only 2 triggered events. What normally triggers an event is obviously an accident if the sensors detect a collision. But with something like TechStream, which is a little bit more, includes a little bit more variety of events than would regular black box data, Trooper Paul explained that because during that 3-point turn, she put it in reverse and then punched the gas over 30%. That triggered the creation of an event. So normally people, when they put their car in reverse, they're not punching the gas. Apparently 30% is the limit on that. If you go over that, you'll create you'll trigger the creation of an event inside your vehicle data. So what Ken is saying is that's a sign of rage shifting. And I think that's a reasonable point, but obviously there'd be no way to prove that beyond a reasonable doubt. But I think it's a reasonable point to speculate that she's already angry. She's already in an argument, and they missed a turn and she's like, fuck this. I don't want to go there. Fuck this. And then she hits the brakes and then angrily puts it in reverse and punches the gas. And, some of that was due to alcohol, but some of it was probably due to rage. And that's the first time Karen had ever triggered any event in her vehicle data since she had owned the car. So that's a very good point, Ken. All right, so we're going to end this, but let's make sure everybody understands what we're doing. We're going to end this here, and I'm going to take about a 5-minute break, so I can go grab a beer and reboot the show. And anybody that's a member, it's a members-only show, so anybody that's a member can join up. The members can come. The membership is $2.99 a month. But if you're a regular here and you don't want to sign up, that's okay. I'm not doing this to try to make people sign up. I'm just trying to find a way to give back to the regulars and the members. So what I'm going to do is, if the people that have emailed me, and several have, I'm going to send them the link. Now, if you come in and you want to come on the show and talk with me or talk to the audience, you can do that. If you don't want to, you can just stay backstage and listen to the show that way. And that's fine too. So because this is members only, it's more likely to be somewhat private, right? But you can't rule out the fact that somebody from Turtle Boy or whatever isn't going to be in there and take screenshots and try to use them. So if you do decide to come on and show yourself, there is a little bit of a risk that they could do that. So just be aware of it. And Jay, no, I am not grifting on it. First of all, let's just finish with that. To be grifting on something does not mean making money. I'm not making much money off this. To be grifting on something is to sacrifice the truth in order to go after what makes you the most money. So if you sell a book on the Richard Allen trial that tries to suggest that Richard Allen was killed by a dark conspiracy of devil worshippers or Odin worshippers, you're doing that because you know it's titillating. It's and it's going to sell more, right? If you're doing that, if you're sacrificing truth in order to make money, then you're a grifter. Let's just, for example, that's the difference between a street performer and a con man. So someone that goes out, remember those guys at Harvard Yard that play the drums or whatever they're doing, or juggling or whatever, they're doing something, they've developed a skill, and they're going to perform. And if you want to throw money in the hat, you can do it. And they're trying to support their hat. You're paying them for their skill. They're not grifting. But if somebody goes out as a con man and tricks you out of the money with bullshit, that's a grifter. It's not really hard to understand. Jay, come on, you can understand it. You can do it. Try real hard. You can do it. All right, guys. So we'll be back in about 5 minutes.